So we have another contender on our world literature island to consider. Perhaps the Iliad will survive. Why or why not? We're looking at the Iliad because some of you will say that age alone is a decent reason to consider a text to be included on this list that's so limited. We want to be sure that we have good reasons for holding this or that text up to our attention. So the Iliad is a survivor, and it's a survivor in lots of ways and for lots of reasons that I think certainly bear examining. So let's go. And as we go, let's of course keep in the back of our pocket our toolkit these 7 questions. What's the text? Who made it? Who uses it? What's it about? How does it work? What's it do? And is it good? These are questions that are going to help us investigate and consider the relative value of a very old text. I mean, after all, it's 2021, and our concerns are surely different from theirs. Interestingly enough, the text, the Iliad, was much loved by this exceptional reader of the 4th century BCE who goes by the name of Alexander the Great. And so we know this for all kinds of interesting reasons, but among other things, we know that Alexander the Great liked this text so much that he kept a copy of it right by his pillow when he went to bed at night. Oh, how I would that you would put copies of our books by your heads at night. But Alexander did. He kept a copy of the Iliad with him, along with a dagger, along with a few other things. Very, very few things. He was very, very mobile. He was up and about. And so it's interesting to ask how on earth, first of all, why? And secondly, how on earth did he understand the value of this book to be? You may or may not be familiar with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was an example for our purposes. He's a great example of who uses it. Well, Alexander the Great used it, and he used it so carefully that he kept it with him at all times. Alexander the Great lived in the years 356 to 323 before the Common Era. This is considered to be the 4th century BCE. He was reading a book that we calculate to be composed sometime around the years 800. We don't really know that for sure, but we don't know when exactly. It's attributed, which is not the same as author, attributed to a man named Homer, who was reputed to have sung it. In fact, the version that we have that's written was sung or performed by a rhapsode, a singer known as Homer. And the story is about events that happened 400, 200, 300 years before then. So we think scholars date the Trojan War to some place between 1200 and 1000 and 1000, 1200 and 10,000 BCE. 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years before the time of Jesus, we're 2,000 years after that. I mean, think about this. A long, long time ago. So we have, 1,000, 1,200, 1,000 here, and then we're 2,000. 3,000 years ago. These already are numbers that are meaningless to me. Old. really, really, really old. And they were certainly meaningless to people at the time. Most people were illiterate. There wasn't these lovely notion of a timeline that we have would have been completely novel to them. It would have been long ago times. And the sequence, the clarity that we have in our textual world of tracking and timing and chronologizing things simply didn't exist. There was now, and there was then, and there was long, long ago. Nevertheless, we can see that there's this reader named Alexander the Great reading about a story from, 800 years before he was living. 800 years. 800 years ago, for me, if I count back, 800 years ago for me is the year 1200. It would be indigenous people on this world. Here in the of Connecticut, 1200 was the time of the cathedrals and the feudal states of medieval Europe. So 800 years ago for me, this is 800 years ago from Alexander. He knew that this was long ago. The book, Alexander's an interesting character, well worth reading about. If you have no background, go ahead, quickly gloss the Wikipedia page and come up to speed. But he was a son of a king. His father's name was Philip. He was a Greek who grew in a land called Macedonia, the northern part of Greece. The 4th century was a time of significant Greek culture. In fact, so rich and so lettered that he had a great teacher named Aristotle. The great philosopher Aristotle was his teacher. And that teacher had used the Iliad to train that young boy, and that teacher had annotated the version of the Iliad that Alexander kept with him. It would be like you living your life with a copy of Captain Kirk's notes with you at all times. Wood for the day. But certainly he treasured it. Alexander was an incredibly bright, incredibly physically strong, very handsome. 20 years old, his dad died in all of these political ways, and he became, right away, used that moment and used that time to take over the Greek armies and to proceed to conquer an unbelievable amount of land, culture, and peoples. Alexander was outrageous. He had mastered, he'd inherited this wonderful Greek military notion of the phalanx. So a phalanx was a bunch of soldiers getting up, lined up in a row with their shields in front of them, and together, locked together, disciplined together, organized together, moving together, they could just plow forward. As a result, because of the phalanx, their spears could be a little bit longer. And between the discipline, the technology of the phalanx, and that extra purchase of their spears, their opponents couldn't win. They had a novel, new military technology that allowed them to be incredibly effective. So what Alexander did, here we have my very bad map, but just to give you an example, he, at 20 years old, proceeded to move across the Mediterranean, across into the Persian Empire, which is now considered to be part of Turkey, and he fought wonderful Darius III, the great Persian king, and every time he fought him, he won. He beat him here, he beat him here, he pressed on to Mesopotamia, he spread out into what is now Iraq and Iran, he stretched out all the way to the northern parts of India. So here's this huge, and all across the Mediterranean, conquering what is now Syria, Lebanon, Israel, conquering Egypt along the shore. A massive, massive military success. from 20 years old to 32. In 12 years, he spent his 20-somethings conquering the East. And it's quite an amazing story. It's also an amazing story that all along the way he kept his copy of the Iliad. And even as he was pressing into Persia, it was important for him to stop at Troy. And he did the most incredible thing. He's there with his best bud Hephaestion, a brother in arms, probably a lover, a comrade, a very, very close and prized relationship to him. They get to Troy. They do some of the things that the Iliad talks about. They stop and pray on the shore. They go to the city itself and take a run, ripping off their clothes naked, running around Troy 3 times, which is exactly what Achilles did. So this little side trip to Troy, it wasn't actually a reasonable route in terms of the military battle. He stopped in the middle of the battle, took a little road trip to Troy, and then had this little make-believe reenactment of the scene from the Iliad. Like, what's up with that? Come back in a second and we'll talk a little bit more about the Iliad.